In the early hours of the morning, something quietly changed at Lake Oroville. There were no storms pushing in from the Pacific, no heavy rain falling in the mountains upstream, no emergency alerts buzzing phones or flashing warnings on television screens. Most of California was asleep, unaware that one of the most closely monitored reservoirs in the state had begun to behave in a way that didn't make sense. At first, it was just numbers on a screen. Routine readings updated minute by minute as they always do. But then operators noticed the trend. The water level wasn't just rising, it was climbing faster than it should, much faster. The kind of rise engineers usually see only during major flood events, yet there was no flood, no weather system, no explanation. Lake Oroville is watched constantly. Every inch of water is tracked, measured, and recorded. So when the numbers kept increasing, the first assumption was simple. Something had to be wrong with the instrument. Sensors fail, data can lag, systems sometimes glitch. Operators checked the primary gauge and flagged the reading as suspicious. Then they checked the backups. The backup systems showed the same thing. A third system confirmed it. By that point, concern began to spread through the control room. This was no longer a technical error. The lake was genuinely rising, and it was doing so without any obvious cause. As the minutes passed, the increase continued. The water climbed higher and higher, far beyond what normal inflow could explain. By sunrise, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Lake Oroville had risen more than 20 feet in just a few hours. No rain, no scheduled releases, no visible source of water. For anyone familiar with the dam's history, that number carried weight. It carried memory. Lake Oroville is not just a reservoir, it is a pressure point. Behind the tallest dam in the United States sits an enormous volume of water, held back by concrete, rock, and trust. Millions of people live downstream. Entire communities depend on the assumption that what's happening behind that dam is understood, controlled, and predictable. This time it was. When water appears where it shouldn't, the danger isn't only about how high it rises. The real danger lies in why it's moving at all. The official timeline painted a troubling picture. At 2:17 a.m., the lake's surface elevation was recorded at 860 feet. The number ticked upward minute by minute. By 8:41 a.m., the water stood at 883 feet, a rise of more than 23 feet in less than 7 hours. Engineers moved quickly. They reviewed inflow data from upstream rivers, nothing unusual. They checked records from other dams. No releases had been made. Rain gauges showed no overnight precipitation. Satellite data revealed no landslides feeding the reservoir. Cameras captured nothing out of the ordinary. Outflow through the power plant and spillway remained unchanged. The dam wasn't releasing extra water. It was receiving it from somewhere unknown. The log entries were short and direct. Reservoir elevation exceeded prior day by 23 feet. Instrumentation verified. No apparent surface inflow source. In plain terms, the water was real. The explanation was missing. For people living downstream, this wasn't just a technical anomaly, it was a reminder. In February of 2017, damage to Oroville's spillway forced operators to limit releases. Water rose rapidly. When it overtopped the emergency spillway, erosion threatened the dam's foundation. The situation escalated quickly, and nearly 188,000 people were evacuated across 3 counties. That event changed how Californians looked at the dam. The memory never fully faded, so when rumors began circulating about an unexplained surge in water levels years later, concern spread quietly, not through panic but through experience. By mid-morning, the Department of Water Resources activated its dam safety response protocol. Field teams were dispatched immediately. When they arrived, the changes were visible. The shoreline had moved far beyond previous markers. Maintenance roads near the edge of the lake were partially submerged. Slopes that had been dry days earlier were now saturated, showing signs of instability. This was not a routine inspection. Every step was documented. GPS coordinates were logged. Photos were taken. Samples were collected under strict procedures. Engineers moved carefully, aware that rapid changes in water pressure can alter conditions beneath the surface in unpredictable ways. The lake was behaving as if something unseen had shifted below. As samples were sent to labs, attention turned to understanding the water itself. If it hadn't come from rain or rivers, then where had it come from? The answer would not come easily. While the surface of the lake looked calm, the data told a different story. Something had introduced a large volume of water into the reservoir in a very short amount of time, and whatever caused it had done so silently, without warning, without visibility. By the afternoon, the first test results began to arrive. Instead of providing clarity, they raised new questions. The chemical makeup of the water did not match typical surface runoff. Mineral levels were unusually high. Certain elements suggested a deeper origin, far below the watershed that normally feeds the lake. In simple terms, the water didn't belong there. That realization marked a shift in how officials viewed the event. This was no longer just a mystery of missing rain. It was a sign that something beneath the reservoir may have changed, something that could not be seen from above. As the lake continued to hold steady at its higher level, one fact became clear. The surge had stopped, but the system had not reset. Whatever allowed that water to enter the lake may still exist below the surface. And when massive systems move without explanation, the danger isn't always immediate. Sometimes it's delayed. By late afternoon, the focus shifted away from the surface of Lake Oroville and toward what lay beneath it. The water had stopped rising, but no one felt relief. Stabilization did not mean resolution. Large systems do not simply return to normal because the numbers stop moving, especially not systems this old, this massive, and this critical. Inside state laboratories, technicians worked quickly. The water samples collected that morning were now being analyzed under controlled conditions. At first glance, nothing seemed dramatic, but as the data built layer by layer, patterns began to emerge that didn't align with expectations. Conductivity levels were higher than usual. Turbidity readings showed more suspended particles than surface runoff typically carries. Then came the mineral analysis. Lithium, boron, trace amounts of rare earth elements. These weren't contaminants and they weren't random, they were signatures. These elements are usually found deep underground, locked inside bedrock or carried by pressurized groundwater that has been isolated from the surface for long periods of time. They do not appear in large quantities from rainfall or river inflow. Even snowmelt does not carry this profile. Isotope testing ruled out weather as the source. The chemical fingerprint did not match river systems feeding the lake. Quality controls were checked and rechecked. There was no lab error, no sample contamination. The conclusion, while cautious, was clear. This water did not come from where it should have. That realization sent a ripple through the investigation. If the surge hadn't come from above, then it had to come from below. And that possibility raised a far more unsettling set of questions. Attention turned underground. Seismologists at the U.S. Geological Survey began reviewing data recorded in the hours leading up to the surge. What they found did not appear dramatic at first. No major earthquakes. No shaking that residents would have felt, but buried in the records was a cluster of tiny events. Micro-earthquakes. These tremors were extremely small, too weak to cause damage or even be noticed by people on the surface. But their timing was precise. They occurred just hours before the lake began to rise, and their locations traced fault zones beneath the reservoir. In rare cases, seismic activity like this can open or reactivate fractures in rock layers. When that happens, pressurized groundwater trapped deep below can suddenly find a new pathway upward. If the pressure is high enough, water can move quickly, silently, and in large volumes. Similar events have been documented near large reservoirs in parts of India and China. In those cases, changes in water load altered stress along faults, triggering small tremors that opened underground channels. The result was unexpected water movement, sometimes into reservoirs, sometimes away from them. The theory was uncomfortable, but it fit the evidence. A hidden fracture system, briefly opened by seismic movement, may have allowed deep, mineral-rich water to surge upward into Lake Oroville. Still, no one was ready to call it proven. Engineers cautioned against jumping to conclusions. Subsurface systems are complex. Correlation does not always mean causation. More data was needed. And as investigators looked deeper, another possibility began to emerge, one that carried even greater risk. Engineers reviewing internal dam sensor data noticed subtle changes that hadn't triggered alarms but couldn't be ignored. Drainage water collected from internal galleries had become slightly cloudy in certain areas. Pressure readings inside the dam showed small fluctuations during the surge window. Individually, these signals might not mean much. Together, they formed a pattern that engineers know well. Internal erosion. Often called piping, internal erosion occurs when water begins moving through tiny pathways inside or beneath a dam, slowly carrying material with it. At first, the changes are small, slight discoloration, minor pressure shifts. But if the process continues unchecked, those pathways can widen, weakening the structure from within. History offers painful lesson. The Teton Dam failed after small warning signs were dismissed. Sardoba Dam collapsed after subtle anomalies went unresolved. In each case, early indicators were present, but the system appeared stable until it was. To be clear, Lake Oroville showed no signs of immediate failure. There was no breach, no collapse, no emergency spillway erosion. But the overlap in timing between the unexplained water rise and these internal signals was enough to demand urgent attention. If water had moved through or beneath the dam in a new way, the system may have changed permanently. As word spread within agencies, pressure began to mount from all sides. Water managers wanted answers. Agricultural districts worried about supply planning. Environmental groups demanded transparency. Emergency officials quietly reviewed evacuation maps that hadn't been unfolded since 2017. Downstream communities noticed increased patrols along levees. The activity alone was enough to stir memories. People remembered how quickly calm had turned into crisis before. This was no longer just a scientific investigation. It was about trust. Trust in infrastructure, trust in monitoring systems, trust that if something was wrong, someone would know before it was too late. Public statements remained careful. Officials emphasized that the situation was under control, that there was no immediate danger, that monitoring had been increased. All of that was true, but behind closed doors, conversations were more direct. Large dams are not static objects. They interact constantly with the earth around them. Pressure changes, water moves, stress shifts. When something unexpected happens, even if it stops, it leaves behind questions that don't fade easily. By evening, Lake Oroville looked calm again. The shoreline had stopped creeping outward. The surface reflected the sky like it always had. To an observer standing at a distance, nothing seemed wrong. But appearances can be misleading. If fractures had opened beneath the lake, they might still exist. If sediments had shifted, they would not neatly return to their original position. If pressure pathways had changed, the internal balance of the system was now different, even if the water level remained steady. The surge did not end in disaster, but it did leave behind a warning. And warnings are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive quietly in the form of water that moves when it shouldn't, and systems that behave differently without explaining why. When night fell over Lake Oroville, the numbers on the monitoring screens finally stopped changing. The water level held steady. No new spikes, no sudden drops. To the public, the story appeared to be over. Another scare that passed without consequence. But for the people watching the system closely, this was not an ending. It was a pause. Large structures like Oroville Dam are not like switches that turn on and off. They are living systems, constantly responding to pressure, temperature, and movement deep below the surface. When something unusual happens, even briefly, it leaves behind effects that don't simply vanish. Engineers understood this well. That is why the response did not slow down when the lake stabilized. It accelerated. Additional sensors were activated. Ground deformation data from satellites was pulled in. Older records were re-examined. The goal was not just to explain what had already happened, but to understand what could happen next. One question sat at the center of every discussion. Did the surge change the system permanently? If deep groundwater had found a new pathway into the reservoir, that path might still be open. Even if pressure equalized and flow slowed, the route would remain a weakness. A future rain event, a small earthquake, or even seasonal changes could reactivate it. That possibility alone was enough to keep officials awake. Teams conducted high-resolution scans around the dam and reservoir basin. Ground-penetrating radar mapped areas that had never been examined in such detail before. The results were not dramatic, but they were not comforting either. Several zones showed subtle anomaly, areas where signals behaved differently than expected. Nothing that screamed failure, but enough to suggest the subsurface was more complex than models assumed. This was not unusual. Many large dams were built decades ago, using the best knowledge available at the time. But geology does not stop evolving just because a structure is placed on top of it. In the days that followed, quiet preparations began. Not evacuations, not public warnings, but readiness. Emergency managers reviewed communication plans. Transportation agencies checked road conditions along evacuation routes. Local officials were briefed on what to say if questions arose. The memory of 2017 lingered like a shadow. Back then, the crisis didn't start with panic. It started with uncertainty, conflicting information, delays. By the time evacuation orders were issued, trust had already been shaken. No one wanted a repeat of that. Meanwhile, public interest surged online. Satellite images were shared. Amateur analysts posted theories. Some claimed secret dam failures. Others blamed climate manipulation or hidden construction defects. Officials responded carefully. Overreaction could cause fear. Silence could cause suspicion. Every statement was measured, factual, and incomplete by necessity. The truth was simple and uncomfortable. They did not fully understand what had happened. And in science, uncertainty is not failure, but in public safety, uncertainty demands caution. One of the most unsettling realizations came from reviewing historical data. Small, unexplained fluctuations in lake level had occurred before. Nothing this large, nothing this fast, but enough to suggest this might not have been a one-time event. It raised a difficult question. Had the system been quietly adjusting for years? If so, what changed this time? Some researchers pointed to long-term stress buildup. Years of drought followed by intense wet season. Rapid shifts between extremes can strain geological systems in ways that gradual change does not. Others focused on reservoir-induced seismicity. The idea that the weight of large bodies of water can influence fault behavior is not new, but its effects are still not fully predictable. Lake Oroville holds billions of tons of water. When that load shifts even slightly, it changes stress deep underground. Most of the time, the Earth absorbs it. Sometimes it responds. The surge may have been the Earth responding. Not violently, not catastrophically, but clearly. By the end of the week, the immediate danger had passed. No new water movement, no structural damage, no evacuations. Life continued as normal for most people downstream. But for those responsible for the dam, normal no longer meant comfortable. Monitoring protocols were updated, thresholds were adjusted, areas once considered low risk were reclassified for further study. The incident changed how the system would be viewed going forward. And that may be its most important impact. Because disasters are not always defined by what happens, but by what is revealed. The unexplained surge at Lake Oroville did not cause destruction. It did not flood cities or force mass evacuations, but it exposed gaps in understanding. It showed that even heavily monitored systems can behave in unexpected ways. In an era of aging infrastructure and increasing environmental stress, that lesson matters. We often think danger comes with noise. Storms, sirens, shaking ground. But sometimes the most serious warnings arrive quietly, measured in data points and chemical signatures, visible only to those who know where to look. The lake looks calm now, the shoreline has settled, boats move across the surface like nothing ever happened. But beneath that calm surface, the system remembers. Pressure paths may have shifted, fractures may have opened and closed, water may have traveled routes it never used before. And once the Earth shows you it can change, you cannot pretend it won't do it again. The story of Lake Oroville is not about panic, it is about awareness. Because safety is no longer just about the storms we can see coming. It is about understanding the hidden forces beneath our feet, long before they decide to move again. And when water rises without a storm, the most important question is never how high it went. It's what it taught us before it stopped.